policy in Asia. Our guest is Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, currently the acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, a career Foreign Service officer, graduate University of Alabama in 1965. Now that's interesting. I have a son-in-law who's an Auburn graduate, and he doesn't cheer when people say that. The ambassador was Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Alabama. His primary experience, of course, has been in Asian affairs while in the State Department, although he did have very early in his career was in the Dominican Republic. He's been to OECD with the American Mission in Paris. He served as a legislative assistant to Representative Leach in 1981, and he has served in the Personnel Department and Liaison Department of the State Department. But as I say, his primary experience, as you would expect, is in Asian affairs. He primarily, and I shouldn't say primarily, but in terms of years at least, Japan. He's a product of the Foreign Service Institute's School of Japanese Language in Japan. He has served as an economic and commercial officer, as an economic officer, a political officer in Japan. He's been a desk officer with responsibilities for economic affairs and again with political affairs, and was in charge of the Japanese desk in the late 1980s. He also, later in his career, was Deputy Chief of Mission in Kuala Lumpur, and he's had extensive experience having served as ambassador to the Philippines, but had been a desk officer for the Republic of the Philippines. He then served as DCM, Minister in DCM in Manila, and then finally as ambassador to the Philippines. More recently, he's worked on Korea, especially the negotiations with North Korea, and has chaired a team reviewing our relationships with Korea. So the ambassador is deeply experienced, a 36-year career to date in the State Department, one of the department's genuine Asian experts. And we're absolutely delighted to be able to welcome him this evening. Ambassador Hubbard.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bird, and good evening. I almost always begin my speeches by telling the audience how delighted and honored I am to be here. And tonight I think I need to add how relieved we are to be here. The rain rendered I-95 near zero visibility as we drove in here this evening, and fortunately, Dr. Bird enclosed in his packet for me a very good set of directions, and we got here. And also, fortunately, we have a little glimmer of the harbor out there. Dr. Bird also enclosed for us, or for me, a very impressive list of the speakers who have preceded me at this lectern. I think this list says much about the council, as does the size of this rainy evening crowd tonight. It says something about the esteem in which the council is held and the purposes to which it is dedicated, including, obviously, a citizenry that is educated and informed in foreign affairs. And speaking to an audience like this is a great pleasure, and so also is listening to an audience like this. So I hope to get through my speech as quickly as possible and leave plenty of time to hear your comments and questions and try to answer. And I want to thank whoever it was somewhere back in the room that almost gave me a roll tide. I don't hear one of those very often around here, but there must be somebody who knows the University of Alabama back there. But let me, back to East Asia, let me offer you first a broad look at the region, focused on general political, economic, and security trends as we see them, and tell you a little bit about our interests in the region and what we're doing to try to realize them. And having sketched out this scene setter, as we call it in the bureaucracy, I'll try to move on to some specifics about our policy in Northeast Asia, where I spend much of my time, and some of the challenges and opportunities that we face there. The overall picture of the Asia-Pacific region in 2001 is positive, guardedly. I add that word guardedly because in a region as vast and as diverse as East Asia and the Pacific, not all of the trends we observe are moving in the same direction. There's a mixture. Some of what we see is very positive, some less so. And much of what we are seeing today, China's emergence as a regional power, Indonesia's democratic transformation, Japan's effort at economic reform, and the situation on the Korean Peninsula, to offer just a few examples, is beyond prognostication. We are nevertheless active on all of these fronts, and we are working hard to encourage the most positive outcomes. The region's economy is no exception to this guardedly positive pattern. There's plenty on the positive side of the ledger. The East Asian Pacific region is a place of enormous economic opportunity. Baltimore, with its major port and one of the world's top container terminals, has understood this for many years. The Port of Baltimore, I understand, handles over $3 billion in two-way trade with East Asia every year. And that number is growing. In 1999, Baltimore processed over $2.5 billion in trade with Japan and China alone. These are big numbers, and they reflect the fact that East Asia and the Pacific now accounts for over a quarter of the world's gross domestic product. So what's true for Baltimore is also true on a national scale. The United States has enormous trade and economic interests in the region. It is our second largest trading partner after NAFTA, with nearly $500 billion in two-way trade, over a third of U.S. total trade. The region hosts some of the fastest growing economies and best markets for American products. The U.S. is working closely with countries in the region who share our views on trade liberalization, such as Singapore, with whom we are engaged in negotiations for a free trade agreement. The region provides millions of jobs to American workers and billions of dollars of income to American investors, from large institutional investors to individual owners of mutual funds, such as those offered by Baltimore's T. Rowe Price. Now, most of the countries in the region have made a surprisingly rapid recovery from the devastating 1997-98 financial crisis. Yet unresolved problems, especially in some of the larger economies, remain, including bad debt, corporate restructuring in Japan and Korea, and the restructuring of China's financial and state-owned enterprises. More work needs to be done throughout the region on structural reform to ensure that sustainable growth is achievable. The recovery from the financial crisis of 1997 is due in part to reforms such as liberalization of investment, which helped make regional economies more dynamic. But the major force driving the Asian recovery was the phenomenal growth of the U.S. economy. We kept our markets open for East Asian products. In 1998 and 1999, cumulatively, for example, the Port of Baltimore imported over $5 billion in goods from East Asia, but exported only $760 million to the region. This reflects a larger imbalance of trade that is not sustainable indefinitely. As growth slows in the United States, so it will in Asia as well. That makes it all the more essential that countries in the region accelerate the pace of reform this year. On the regional political front, also, it is not hard to find the positive. Some positive trends are clear. The steady development and consolidation of democratic governance in South Korea, Philippines, Taiwan, Mongolia, Thailand, Indonesia, and even Cambodia. And it is a profoundly important and positive trend. U.S. relations with our 5 Asian treaty allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, Thailand, and the Philippines are also good. We want to nurture these relationships in the region and make them even better. These are countries which, though not our mirror image, share with us certain basic beliefs in democratic governance, open markets, the rule of law, and human rights. Countries that share these beliefs tend to view the world around them and the events that fill it in similar ways. The East Asia-Pacific region is as diverse as it is vast. Technology and the communications revolution have given birth to a number of transnational interests among the Asia-Pacific states. Yet its regional consciousness, or collective sense of identification, remains relatively undeveloped, far, far short of what Europe has achieved. One consequence of this has been the absence of a potent force for regional stability due to a lack of success in developing common strategic goals and objectives. I think over the longer term, more and more regional states will recognize and act on what they share in common, driven in part by globalization processes, but more importantly, by their democratic orientation, which, of course, in the Asia region historically is a very new common denominator. So while we can be moderately optimistic about the future, the present calls for some patience. Only recently, with the emergence of a new security organization, the ASEAN Regional Forum, has there been much regional attention paid to multilateral security cooperation on transnational problems such as smuggling, the environment, piracy, and conflicting territorial claims such as those in the South China Sea. Progress has been slow, but there has been progress. The United States remains highly supportive of this ASEAN Regional Forum and optimistic about the potential for regional cooperation. Just last week, my new boss, Assistant Secretary Jim Kelly, was in Vietnam to prepare the way with other senior regional officials for the July ASEAN Regional Forum ministerial meetings in Hanoi, which Secretary Powell will attend. Secretary Powell has not missed the irony of his first trip to Asia as Secretary of State being back to Vietnam, where he spent several years in a much different capacity back in the 1960s. The growth of these diplomatic exchanges, both bilateral and multilateral, offers hope that we can develop mechanisms to address and resolve regional problems peacefully, enhancing regional security and stability. The regional political infrastructure that supports multilateral efforts to address these and other problems is undergoing profound change beyond the democratization process I mentioned a few minutes ago. In Northeast Asia, of course, 4 major powers intersect. 3 of them, China, Russia, and Japan, are undergoing significant changes in their ability to influence events around them. At the very heart of this intersection of powers, on the Korean Peninsula, there is the possibility of a dramatic change in the status quo. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia's struggle to develop a functional democracy has diverted its attention away from its traditional leadership role in the Association of Southeast Asian States, or ASEAN. ASEAN, which recently expanded its membership to include the states of Indochina itself, has started to drift. And there are also potential flashpoints in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. These are some of the things that we worry about as we look at the region from the perspective of my office. One important element is the U.S. presence. The U.S. presence, diplomatic and military, in the region provides a crucial element of stability in an area undergoing this profound and dynamic change. The region faces continuing challenges to its economic and political stability and remains a place in which armed conflict could occur with little warning. The region's overall stability and our own national interests depend in great measure on our willingness and ability to maintain and apply successfully all dimensions of our regional reach. This allows us to play a key role as a regional balancer and security guarantor to our allies. The United States is committed to playing this role indefinitely, and overwhelmingly, the states of the region welcome and support our presence. Today, in addition to 41 embassies and consulates, from Sapporo in the north to Wellington in the south, the United States maintains about 100,000 forward-deployed military personnel in the region. Roughly half of these forces are stationed in Japan, and another 40% are stationed in the Republic of Korea. The US-Japan Alliance is the linchpin of US security strategy in Asia. Both nations have moved actively in recent years to update the framework and structure of joint cooperation and to strengthen our bilateral relationship. Over the next few years, we anticipate developing with Japan a deep and fruitful strategic dialogue encompassing both economic and security issues, a dialogue built on the foundation of the wide range of beliefs and perspectives we share with Japan and which taps the full potential of our alliance relationship. As an indication of the importance of this relationship, the former Foreign Ministry of Japan, Kono Ichiro, was the first foreign minister to meet with Secretary Powell after the inauguration of President Bush, and the Japanese Prime Minister was one of the first leaders to meet with to meet with Secretary Powell, and the Japanese Prime Minister, as well as the Korean President, were among the first to meet with President Bush. We now look forward to working with a new Prime Minister in Japan, Prime Minister Koizumi, and hope to welcome him also to Washington soon. During his campaign for the presidency of his Liberal Democratic Party earlier this spring, and since his election and assumption of his duties as Prime Minister, Mr. Koizumi has placed considerable emphasis on reform, both economic and political. This is very important to us because a strong Japanese economy is critical to the regional and global economy, and we are prepared to do whatever we can to support Japan's reform efforts. We are especially encouraged by Mr. Koizumi's views on reforming and restructuring the economy, and we look forward to seeing details as they emerge. These, of course, are up to the Japanese government to develop, but they will have to be convincing to the markets and the Japanese people. As I noted a bit earlier, restructuring and cleaning up the banking sector in Japan will provide long-term benefits, not just to Japan, but also to the global economy. And along with continued deregulation and restructuring, we think Japan's further opening to direct foreign investment will promote Japan's growth and strengthen our economic relationship. We also place enormous value on our long and durable alliance relationship with the Republic of Korea, which I'll address in more detail in a moment. More generally, we believe, the Bush administration takes as one of its hallmarks, that enhanced alliance relationships will strengthen our efforts to build stability not only in Northeast Asia, but also in Southeast Asia, where we will also continue to work closely with another major treaty ally, Australia. Southeast Asia is an area of growing economic and political importance, which has felt its share of the turbulence experienced by the region as a whole over the past few years. We are paying a lot of attention to Indonesia. Indonesia is the world's fourth largest country and is still Southeast Asia's largest economy. And we believe it will continue to confront a difficult political and economic transition throughout the coming year. The United States' support for Indonesia's transition to democracy is unwavering. We expect the current political crisis, in which we do not take sides, to be resolved peacefully, democratically, and in accordance with the Constitution, and have reiterated our support for territorial integrity strongly and unequivocally. In Aceh, the Moluccas, Irian Jaya, and elsewhere in Indonesia, we urge all parties to engage in negotiations to avoid violence and reach comprehensive political and economic solutions to conflict. Indonesia will remain a high priority for U.S. assistance programs, focusing on long-term assistance to facilitate economic growth and democratic transition and the building of civil society institutions. The U.S., along with Japan and other foreign governments and the international financial institutions, have demonstrated strong support for Indonesia since the financial crisis of 97-98. Now, though, failure by the Indonesian government to make necessary economic reforms threatens a renewed fiscal and banking crisis in Indonesia. Now, Dr. Bird and I agreed before I came that you might be interested in an assessment of the situation on the Korean Peninsula, and as well as in developments in U.S.-China relations. Let me start with U.S.-China relations so that I can end with Korea, which I know a bit more about. From a broad perspective, our relationship with China is based first and foremost on our national security interests. We understand, and we believe China understands, that our relationship will have a profound impact on the security of Asia. I know that the rest of the countries in Asia believe that as well. The United States, for its part, seeks a constructive relationship with China that contributes to the promotion of our shared interests in peace, security, and prosperity in the region. Now, recent events have called into some question where we stand in our relationship with China and where we want to go. I think they have highlighted the importance of not allowing our relationship to be damaged by miscommunication, mistrust, and misunderstanding about our respective intentions and objectives. We do not view China as an enemy, actual or potential. We view China as a partner on some issues and as a competitor on others. Secretary of State Powell was very clear about our vision in this relationship when he stated in congressional testimony, quote, "China is a competitor and a potential regional rival, but also a trading partner willing to cooperate in the areas, such as Korea, where our strategic interests overlap. China is all of these things, but China is not an enemy, and our challenge is to keep it that way," end quote. So from promoting peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula to dealing with non-proliferation problems to trade, we share common interests with China that are best served by a productive and positive relationship. Clearly, we have some differences. Taiwan is one. Human rights is another, particularly freedom of expression and freedom to express and practice one's faith. Arms sales around the world and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction are also important issues about which we have expressed concern to China. We have been and will continue to be straightforward with China about our interests, including our commitment to Taiwan's self-defense under the Taiwan Relations Act and to freedom of navigation in international waters and airspace. We want to work with the current leaders in China and with the next generation of leaders, which could emerge as early as next year. We will hold China to its bilateral and international commitments. If China chooses to disregard its international obligations in areas as diverse as security issues, human rights, non-proliferation, or trade, we will use all available policy tools to try to persuade it to move in more constructive directions. With regard to Taiwan, we will continue to make available defensive weapons to permit Taiwan to defend itself. Our maintenance of unofficial relations with the people on Taiwan is a fundamental part of our One China policy, a point we have made clear to Beijing. The United States remains committed to the peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences. However, a buildup of military forces around the Taiwan Strait that is specifically aimed at Taiwan and at U.S. capabilities continues. A key provision of the Taiwan Relations Act, to which the United States remains committed, requires that the United States ensure that Taiwan has a sufficient self-defense capability to maintain its democratic governance. And it was in light of the buildup on the part of China, as well as our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act, that we made a decision in April 2001 on arms sales to Taiwan. Now, we believe that after 22 years, the Taiwan Relations Act is working well and does not now need amendment or augmentation. The cutting edge of reform and positive social development in China is really our trade relationship. We have a significant trade deficit with Japan, as the export-import numbers for the Port of Baltimore suggest. In 1999, Baltimore imported $274 million worth of goods from mainland China, but exported only $48 million. In fact, last year, for the first time, our largest trade deficit was not with Japan, but with the People's Republic of China. But our trade with China is deeply in our interest. The marketplace in China promotes American values. Trade encourages more freedom and individual liberties. And you can see that happening in China, where trade has led to greater openness and fewer government controls on day-to-day life, particularly in the coastal region that is most affected by international trade. We support China's entry into the WTO as soon as China is ready to meet WTO standards. And we expect Taiwan, which is ready for entry now, to enter in close proximity with China. We look forward to China's hosting of this year's Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. President Bush has said that he plans to go to Shanghai for that summit in the fall. His presence at the APEC leaders meeting will speak volumes about our commitment to market-oriented economic reform in China. Now, there are some areas beyond the Korean Peninsula and other areas that I've talked about where we would like to expand our cooperation with China. We'd like to work together on narcotics trafficking. China realizes that drugs are a threat to the Chinese people. We want to work with China to combat the spread of HIV/AIDS, which is becoming a tremendous problem in China. And we will continue to work together where possible to protect the environment. China is in a position to chart a mutually beneficial course for our future relationship. This administration, as I said earlier, wants a productive relationship with Beijing that promotes our interests and those of the entire Asia-Pacific region. China's behavior, particularly in the next few months, will determine whether we develop the kind of productive relationship the President wants. We encourage China to make the responsible choices that reflect its stature in and its obligations to the community of nations, and to focus on a very immediate issue. We do expect China to find a way to give back to us our airplane that made an emergency landing on Hainan Island. Once we get beyond that, I think we will be in a much better position to move forward to develop our cooperation further. Now let me conclude with a few brief remarks about the situation on the Korean Peninsula. The U.S. and the Republic of Korea enjoy a very strong security relationship, predicated primarily on deterrence of North Korean aggression. In spite of some positive developments, including the visit to Pyongyang last autumn by then Secretary of State Albright, the military threat posed by North Korea has not significantly abated. The United States remains committed to its treaty obligations to assist in the defense of the ROK in the event of North Korean aggression. And we still have 37,000 troops in South Korea to make that commitment very concrete. Korean President Kim Dae-jung has worked assiduously to strengthen the U.S.-ROK alliance through meetings with President Bush, members of Congress, and cabinet officials. He has made it clear both publicly and privately that a strong bilateral relationship will continue to be key to progress in North-South relations and to be the central element of Republic of Korea diplomatic and security strategy. President Kim has also stated that should reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula be realized, a U.S. military presence on the peninsula would still be needed. And this is an idea that he underlined in his talks with North Korean leader Kim Jong-il in Pyongyang last summer. The Bush administration is now nearing completion of a review of our North Korean policy. Now, during this review, we continued to provide humanitarian aid to the North, which is in tremendous need of food aid. Also, during the policy review, the United States abided by our earlier obligations under the so-called agreed framework, the process under which North Korea's existing nuclear reactors will be replaced with alternative power sources that do not produce plutonium as a byproduct. I believe that a conclusion of our review will be that we will continue to abide by the agreed framework. And the fundamental conclusion of this review is that we should continue to work with regional allies, partners, and friends toward the shared goal of a Korean peninsula free of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. We have remained in contact with North Korea at the working level throughout this policy review. We have also continued our own humanitarian effort to recover some of the remains of servicemen who lost their lives during the Korean War. Now, fundamental to our policy is our support for President Kim Dae-jung's efforts to reduce tension on the peninsula through his own engagement with the North. Along with President Kim's visionary leadership, the strong U.S. Republic of Korea alliance is one of the foundations of the North-South progress that has occurred. Despite this progress, as I say, concerns remain about North Korea, which still devotes half of its struggling economy to military development. And North Korean development, production, and export of ballistic missiles are of particular concern. The U.S., Japan, and the ROK remain in very close touch with each other through our something we call the Trilateral Coordination and Oversight Group, or TCOG. I led the U.S. delegation to such a meeting in Seoul a couple of months ago, and we will be meeting again later this week in Honolulu, at which point I think the results of our policy review will be clear. And that is, I believe, that we will continue to engage with North Korea. We will engage with North Korea not because we trust North Korea, but because we have a tremendous interest in reducing the North Korean threat to our interest in Asia and elsewhere in the world. Our fundamental tenet of our approach will be the closest cooperation with the Republic of Korea and the strongest support for the very courageous efforts that have been led by Kim Dae-jung to reduce tensions on the peninsula through direct dialogue. We have a long way to go, but we will continue both to support the South Korean engagement effort and through our own efforts to try to reduce the North Korean military and proliferation threat. South Korea still faces some significant economic problems. Korea pulled out of the financial crisis of '97 very dramatically, with GDP growth reaching a healthy 10% in 1999 and just a little bit less than that in the year 2000. But this growth, to a certain degree, masks a continuing troubled financial sector and highly leveraged conglomerates, both of which continue to threaten Korean economic prospects. And partly due to the lowered growth expectations in the United States, I think growth in the ROK will be well below last year's level in the year 2001. During the past year, the ROK has moved slowly but steadily to act on President Kim's plans for corporate restructuring and financial sector reforms to ensure continued economic growth and stability. And the challenge for the ROK government now is to change its traditional interventionist policy and allow the markets to do their work, to allow market discipline to carry out its very important functions. We are working with Korean and with American industry to address some specific trade issues we have with Korea, including trade in steel, beef, and automobiles, as well as broader issues related to the protection of U.S. intellectual property. Along with his engagement with North Korea, Kim Dae-jung's push for further democratization in the Republic of Korea has been a hallmark of his presidency. We strongly support both of these efforts and believe their success will strengthen stability and prosperity not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also throughout the region. Now, this is a very brief overview, and I probably left out a lot of countries that people are interested in, issues that people are interested in. Certainly this was not as coherent as I might have wanted to make it, but I wanted to get through it quickly so that I could answer your questions and listen to your comments. So I now conclude my remarks and invite you all to take part. Thank you very much.
Is the current administration going to be biased toward the oil-producing states of the region?
That's one way of putting it. We don't import a great deal of our energy from the East Asian region, although there are some important producers of oil and natural gas like Indonesia, Malaysia, to a lesser degree some of the other countries. You know, in the situation Indonesia faces right now, thank God oil prices are high. They would be in a tremendous crisis right now if they weren't bolstered somewhat by oil earnings. So, you know, I guess every cloud has a silver lining, and one of the silver linings in the current world energy situation is additional earnings for Indonesia, a country that needs them. But no, I don't think, you know, a lot of American companies are very actively engaged in investments in the region. Tragically, right now, one major company, ExxonMobil, has had to shut down its major operations on Natuna Island near Aceh, one of the troubled provinces of Indonesia, because of the violence there. That can't help at all. So we have a lot of reason to want peace, stability, and progress in Indonesia, and that's one of them.
The observation is that you would think with unification would come cost savings of various kinds. Is the administration or today being too cautious about unification?
Well, I think the quick answer is that unification will only save money if it happens the right way. And right now, ironically, neither Korea is really pushing unification. President Kim Dae-jung of the South is pushing a reduction of tensions, peace, reconciliation, eventually peaceful coexistence. But South Korea does not expect or want unification for several years ahead, primarily because North Korea is such a basket case that taking care of the needs of North Korea, dealing with the refugees, dealing with the wrecked economy, would also wreck the South Korean economy and take it down as well. I recall when I first started dealing with Korea significantly in 1993, not too long after German unification. I found both Koreas looking at German unification as a very negative example. The North saw German unification for what it was. It eliminated the communist regime in East Germany and submerged the East German power structure under the West German, and basically the regime didn't survive. The South saw the huge economic burden that the West Germans bore to bring East Germany into the fold, and reached the conclusion they couldn't support it now. We want on the Korean Peninsula what our allies, the South Koreans, want. We think unification is a wonderful goal. We would like to see it happen. We believe a so-called soft landing will probably be better for all of us. It avoids the danger of a lash out militarily by a North Korean military that is still very powerful despite the weak economy. It avoids the huge costs and assistance to refugees and all of that would come if that border was suddenly opened. we want the Koreans to get together. We'd like to get, we would like to be able to, reduce the number of our troops needed to, for deterrent purposes at least. But unification in the short run, I think, would be disaster for everybody.
Two questions. One, do we really have a one China policy? And the second is, what would we really do if there was an attempt to seize Taiwan by military force?
That's the question of the month. In answer to your first question, do we follow a one China policy? Yes, we do follow a one China policy. We officially recognize the People's Republic of China in accordance with the Taiwan Relations Act. We have a non-governmental, a non-official relationship with Taiwan, and we do. Let me just back up a little bit, because you started by asking about some of the visitors and transitors and all of that. We do now have the president of Taiwan in the United States. This is not the first time a Taiwan president has been here, not even the first time this Taiwan president has been here. I was listening to NPR the other day, and it said this was the first visit by President Chen Shui-bian, and it is not. He transited the United States through L.A. About 8 or 9 months ago. What it is the first time Chen Shui-bian has been in New York, the media center of the United States, so it looks like the first visit. It is not a visit either. We call it a transit. It's he's on his way to Latin America, and you can say, well, it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck. I don't want to get into that, but he will not have contact with government officials. His activities have been restricted. He's not supposed to do large meetings and make speeches and that sort of thing. We consider it a transit. Now, that's kind of in a way, the kind of trivial side of following what's going on with Taiwan. The serious side is the question you ask: what would we do if the People's Republic of China decided to take over Taiwan by force? We don't address hypotheticals. But the president did said recently that we are committed, as I said in my speech tonight, under the Taiwan Relations Act, to provide the people of Taiwan with the weapons, the military equipment that they need in order to defend themselves. We would be gravely concerned were there an effort by China to take over Taiwan militarily. One of the very dramatic things that has happened in recent years is the development of democracy on Taiwan. In fact, a democracy that is now, in effect, voted out the people who created the country and created the entity and brought in a new government. We certainly have strongly warned the Chinese against that, but we don't address exactly what we would do in a particular circumstance.
Is it appropriate for the United States government to try to create a program acceptable to North Korea for visitations by American Koreans to North Korea to find long-lost relatives?
Well, my first answer is that there no longer is any law against American citizens traveling to North Korea. So individual Korean Americans who have American citizenship are free to visit North Korea. I should add that the South Koreans look askance on that, don't like to see ethnic Koreans with South Korean lineage traveling to North Korea. There's one American citizen under arrest now in South Korea that we're very concerned about. But by and large, Americans are free to travel to North Korea, and that includes Korean Americans. This is an issue that has been raised with us, one that we are very concerned about and interested in. In fact, among our very best friends in Washington is the family of a 94-year-old Korean American who was born in North Korea and would really love to be able to go back and see some of his, I guess very few of his relatives are still around, but at least see his homeland, and I'd like to see that happen as well. We have been very supportive of the effort between South and North Korea to set up mechanisms for family reunions. These have so far been very limited, but I think fairly successful. We would like to see, at the appropriate time, the expansion of that mechanism so that perhaps some Korean Americans could take part in it. Our relationship with North Korea has not reached a stage where, as a government, we believe that we can go to the North Koreans and try to set up such a mechanism, but maybe someday we'll get there.
Do you expect pluralism in 5 years in Malaysia?
Well, the Prime Minister's in his 70s now, I believe, and one could expect sometime, I would think, before too long, a transition. In fact, I think he himself has at one time or another talked about dropping out 2 years from now when there's the next UMNO party election or whatever. I was in Malaysia just recently, had a chance to meet with the deputy prime minister and heir apparent. He didn't enlighten me in any way on when he thought he would be taking over as prime minister. Malaysia is a strange case. We lived there 3 years. It's a country that has genuine grassroots democracy down to the kampongs all around the country. People are voting for the party officials, et cetera, et cetera. Elections are by and large free. The problem is, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but it seems a little bit like King on the Mountain. Once you're elected, anything goes. And you know, at various times, we've seen you know, the Supreme Court justices, you know, fired or squeezed out of office. We see arrests under an Internal Security Act, which certainly doesn't conform with our ideas of democracy and human rights. We would like to see Malaysia open up more, but I wouldn't want to. I don't really class Malaysia as a non-pluralistic country simply because people do vote. People do vote freely, and there's really a lot of grassroots activity. It's a system that seems to lack some of the procedural safeguards that ours has, that we think are very important.
What is our basic position with respect to the American presence on Okinawa?
Well, I think I think he phrased it a little more negatively. What is our stand on Japan's desire to see the U.S. out of Okinawa? Japan wants us very much in Okinawa as part of their defense, as part of their protection. The government of Japan supports our presence there. In fact, I met last week with the governor of Okinawa, and he too supports our presence there. And there was a recent poll out just focused on Okinawa, which indicated that about 50% of the Okinawans would like to see the U.S. remain there. So it's even on Okinawa, it's half and half. What they would like, what I think I know Okinawans would like to see is for us to reduce some of the scale of our presence, reduce some of the nuisances that flow from the presence. We have a Marine expeditionary force there, huge number of young Marines who we think actually act a lot better and behave a lot better in Okinawa than they do in Paris Island or Camp Pendleton. But still, there are problems that occur, and these become acute in a foreign country, in a place like Okinawa. So we're very attentive to that. The fundamental point is that the government of Japan strongly, and with the exception of China and perhaps North Korea, the other countries of the region very much want a U.S. military presence as a stabilizing force in the region. And you can't have that presence without training. We can't have our troops out there without conducting training, and some things like night landing practice and Marines jogging on the public roads and bombing ranges and things like that are those things that fall under that category of you know, you got to do it, but NIMBY, not in my backyard. And I think Americans feel very much the same way. So we're dealing with that kind of issue. We're very attentive to their concerns and hoping to maintain the presence we need while while restructuring our presence so that it causes less nuisance, particularly in Okinawa where it's very intense.
Basic question concerns the ability of the regime to maintain a coherent China. And the follow-up question is, does it make sense for China to try to maintain a single large national entity, and how do those problems affect Taiwan?
Well, I'm not a China scholar, so I won't get deeply into this, but I think, it probably doesn't matter a whole lot what we think about whether China ought to be hanging on to Xinjiang or Tibet. The critical point is the Chinese assert that they're a single nation, that this is part of China. What we have urged, we haven't challenged the integrity of Chinese territory. What we have urged is that they respect regional autonomy, that they respect the Tibetans' right to practice their religion. In fact, we made that palpable today when the President received the Dalai Lama at the White House, or in the White House residence, which is less official than the White House itself, and the Secretary of State received him as a religious leader. We would like to see them given the respect and autonomy we think they're due, and we feel the same way about some of the Muslim minorities in Xinjiang and elsewhere. So, minorities are debilitating. Minorities are both a strength and a weakness almost wherever they occur. We find them a strength. I think the Chinese might find it a strength also if they began to try to deal with them as cultures that are respected and granted autonomy.
Would you give us an advance on the review on Korean policy?
Well, I think I'm being drawn inexorably into the minefield of South Korean politics, and I will stay away from that. But I will say that I believe that the meeting between President Bush and President Kim was as often happens, over-interpreted by the press. President Bush said he was skeptical of North Korea. Well, I think we all are skeptical of North Korea. There's nothing new about that. Doesn't mean you don't deal with them. He also said he very strongly supported Kim Dae-jung's policy of engagement with North Korea. That part didn't get the headlines, but it remains true. No, we believe that South Korean engagement with North Korea is a very healthy thing in many ways, and that it has achieved some important successes. I think the family reunions are very important. I think a development of immense importance will take place when the railway is reopened between South and North Korea. In fact, it will give South Korea for the first time a direct land access to the Eurasian landmass, both China and possibly Russia. So some very important things are happening, and the change on the peninsula is absolutely palpable. We think that's very important, a very good development. We wish to continue to encourage that, regardless of who is elected in Korea the next time.
Will the Japanese increase their share of the cost of maintaining an American presence, and is banking reform real?
On the first question, I must say I never heard President Bush say that during the campaign, but maybe I wasn't listening carefully enough. I mean, this has been an appeal by many politicians for a long time, and in fact, I think we're satisfied with the way the Japanese have responded. The Japanese pay now roughly $4 billion per year for the support of our forces in Japan. They cover almost all of the non-personnel cost of having our forces there. You see some of the best military housing you'll see anywhere in the world, and that's all built by and financed by the Japanese. They pay far more in host nation support than any other country, and even last year when they faced Japan has had economic growth of practically zero for the last decade. They have still maintained that level and, in fact, increased it a bit. So I don't want to I know I haven't heard George W. Bush, the president, say that. If he said it during the campaign, I wouldn't want to contradict him, but I think largely we are satisfied with that level. On your second point about the banking system, golly, we hope they will engage in real reform. They have put it off for a decade. This is a tremendous problem hanging over not only the Japanese economy but the global economy. They really need to deal with it. The new Prime Minister Koizumi says the right things about reform. We certainly hope he carries that out. The Japanese are facing an important election, a real turning point election for their upper house in July, and I think the results of that election will have a lot to say about whether about the course of reform. But we're certainly promoting it.
The question is our relationship with Asian states, especially in the field of technology.
Well, it's that's the growing part of the global economy, but it has obviously been volatile recently. I think the interesting thing is that you use the word Asian technology because I have the sense that basically what has been happening in recent years is that the Asians are building American technology. Most of the American high-tech firms, certainly the information technology firms, have manufacturing facilities throughout the region in Taiwan, Malaysia, the Philippines, even China to a certain degree. What's really happening is we are importing Asian high technology designers to the United States. They're helping American companies become the leading edge in technology, and then in fact a lot of that manufacturing is happening in Asia. So when you look at I'm pleased, I mentioned it a couple times tonight, but I'm pleased that there's less and less emphasis on trade deficits as a problem. I used to follow our trade relations with Malaysia very closely when Malaysia was leading the world as an assembler and a manufacturer of U.S. electronics components. And in fact, it was natural that we had, sort of a 1/3 trade deficit with Malaysia because, by and large, we were exporting 2/3 of a product to Malaysia, where Malaysians added the final third and then shipped it back to the United States as 3/3. And I think if you really examine international trade and a lot of the trade that comes through Baltimore, it will look just like that.
For a absolutely comprehensive presentation, very full answers to our questions, and I think a thoroughly educational and informative evening. We thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.